Hi, this is Lamar, and you're listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Getting to Third Space is produced by Tenacious Change, a consultancy committed to creating resilient, nonprofit organizations. This podcast is available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. Wherever you listen to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom, be sure to subscribe to hear about new episodes when they become available. Also, be sure to share this podcast with friends, colleagues, and family. The more people join us, the quicker we get to third space as a society.
Hey Lamar, how you doing today?
Hey, doing well, Tom. How about you?
Well,
staying warm out there?
Oh no, it is a miserable day here in Maryland. It has been raining cats and dogs all day and blowing like crazy, and it's cold. We can look out our window and really it's actually flooding yards. It's been very intense. I understand you've had just delightful weather today too, though.
Yeah, in fact, we had to reschedule this so I could get the rest of my driveway shoveled. So we get about, I haven't heard officially, but on my yard, it's about 7 inches of snow overnight. And my wife, who has clients who come to the house, needed a place to park. And so I've been out shoveling snow most of the morning.
So does that mean you have a snow blower on your list for later this year?
No, I mean, this happens so rarely in Kansas that, I wouldn't know where to put it. But I got to tell you, though, there were people out with snowblowers. I don't know where they brought them from, but they have them. But living in a small community, you get to know people, and that's really kind of cool during a time like this.
Yeah.
Because my neighbor 2 or 3 houses down came by with a skid steer, and he said, "Hey, you want me to get the entryway to your driveway cleaned out? You know, like where all the snow plows push everything."
Yeah.
I said, "Absolutely." So he had that all cleaned out. So, thanks to Mike for taking the time to clean out the front part of my driveway. That was great.
Oh, that is really, really nice. I remember a snowstorm so bad in Iowa one year that all the highways around me were down to 1 lane.
Oh my, yeah.
And with really high drifts, it was amazing. I don't know how people actually got. I mean, you really cared about your neighbor in that moment because you couldn't go flying down the highway because you might go around a curve and boom, there somebody is. So it was amazing to see just how cautiously people navigated in that kind of situation.
Living in Iowa, people, we were much more used to this kind of weather.
Yeah.
Had it more often, right?
Yes.
Than here in Kansas. So when it snows here, it's like, I don't want to go out on the roads. I'm comfortable being on the roads myself. But I see what other people are doing who are not used to it. And so I would rather just kind of let them take a day or two to get used to it.
Well, Lamar, you remember driver's ed in Iowa? They taught us how to drive on this stuff. And they taught us how to drive on snow and ice and in water. And so when I moved to the East Coast, I just figured, well, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to get 6 inches of snow, not a thing. I go out there and what I realized was, it's not about whether I could drive in it. It's about whether anybody else can drive in it.
Absolutely.
And the answer to that was, no, not many. So the safest thing to do is just to stay in.
That's right. That's for the first day or two, let everyone get acclimated to it.
Absolutely.
But I do have to tell you, though, I got my exercise in for today and maybe tomorrow.
Excellent.
So we're good.
Excellent. Well, actually, if you can't move tomorrow, you got your exercise for these 2 days, right? So,
that's right.
Well, I suppose we ought to get to it because we just finished up our last podcast was part 1 with Seth Kaplan, and today's podcast features part 2 of what was nearly a 90-minute conversation we had with Seth. Wow. And our listeners will remember that Seth Kaplan is a leading expert on what is known as fragile states. He's also the author of Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society, One Zip Code at a Time. Now, in part one, we talked a lot about the concepts of fragile states and fragile neighborhoods. In this segment, in part two, we shifted the conversation and focused more on civil dialogue and conversation and its relationship to strengthening fragile states and fragile neighborhoods. So, Lamar, I was just thinking about this a little while ago, but before we get into part two of the interview, what if we reflected just a bit on our takeaways from part one?
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, and I think, you set it up well in that part two is kind of where we get into where the work that you and I have been doing together kind of intersects with the work that Seth has been doing and that he's been writing about. The civil dialogue, and then how building relationships impact the kind of work that the folks that he refers to. So one of the questions that we had, and that he was answering quite well, was, how do you strengthen neighborhoods that are fragile? Neighborhoods that maybe don't have the connectedness. And I think that was a lot of what he talked about. Just like I had a guy down the street came with his skid steer to take care of the front part of my driveway. But if you don't have that, I would probably still be out there and maybe not even able to get in and out of my driveway for a day or so. But how do you strengthen the fragile neighborhoods? And I thought that when he was exploring that was very helpful to me. Building relationships, as we're going to be talking about this second half, but also what's missing. I think in my mind, kind of the corner store or the shopkeeper that knows the kids, or in his example is, where do you take your child when they're injured? Well, run down the street to the nurse. There's 7 of them who live within the same neighborhood. So I think that just learning how to be interdependent, learning how to live together in a neighborhood and know who's who. He talked about knowing who lives behind the doors in your neighborhood. I thought that was a really good visual for me. So I found a lot of really helpful descriptions that Seth was giving us in part one.
Yeah. And you talked about that interdependence, and I think when I reflect on what I heard in that first part of the interview, there are actually a couple quotes that I went back and I grabbed. One was, at least I think they're quotes. It's really close anyway. When you live in a place where there are relationships and norms, he said, there's a sense of willful interdependence brought about by lots of interactions. And the thing that really grabbed me about that, and you referenced the interdependence, and you gave an example of that. But there's a quality of that has to be willful. You have to be willing to make yourself interdependent with other people, or to allow other people to reach out to you. And that mutuality of dependence is so critical, but it has to be an intentional and willful thing that takes place. The other quote that I heard, and then I went back and I grabbed, is, if you are involved, you are, without even thinking about it, building trust. And this really came out of that portion where we were talking about how you go about building trust in relationships, or maybe it was even when we were talking about when nonprofits, how do they go about building trust? And he emphasized this idea that if you're just simply involved with other people, without even being aware of it, you're actually building trust between yourself and that other person. Those were 2 real gems that I took away from that particular segment of the podcast.
It was packed full of gems. Seth Kaplan has a way of he doesn't waste a lot of words.
No, he doesn't.
He shares a lot of great ideas. So I think we're ready for part 2, don't you think?
I think so. So,
and if the listener hasn't, you as a listener haven't listened yet to part 1, you don't necessarily need to listen to that before part 2. However, you are going to want to go back and take an opportunity to listen to part 1 as soon as you have that opportunity to do so, and to kind of digest that information. And it'll probably it'll be a nice complement to this part 2 section that we're just getting ready to put out there. So for now, here's part 2 of our conversation with Seth Kaplan. So to put you on the spot just a little bit, Seth, what is the single most important thing that Tom or I as individuals can do to build trust with people?
You're talking about people you've never met before.
Yes.
I would say the most important thing is spend time with them. That might mean over food. When in my business, a lot of what we do involves meals, drinking. Doesn't mean ending up on the floors or anything like that, but it's basically lubricating relationships so that people have a sense that of camaraderie, fraternity, and I mean, I run brain trusts. I run something called practice groups, and a lot of that is just finding ways for people to feel that they have a sense of ownership. They have a sense of it's giving people the say in what we do, and so on and so forth. But I would say that spending time with people, showing up over and over again, it really helps to show up over and over again. The first few times you show up, people may not trust you. But if you show up over and over again, if you really want to build trust, move into their neighborhood. They may not trust you initially, but that would be a sign that you have you basically have to show up over and over again. You have to talk to them many times. The fact that you are physically there can make a huge difference. The more the relationship is built before any type of transaction is undertaken, very important.
Well, Seth, we're going to pivot just a little bit and talk about your experience with civil conversations and even what your work may tell us about civil conversations and their role. So, in your opinion, what makes one conversation civil and another not?
It depends a little bit on what you're doing, where you're doing it. I would expect people in a meeting room to have a different relationship than they were if they're having dinner together. And I would expect people who had spent a long time in violent conflict to behave differently than you might speak to your neighbor. I hate to use these extreme examples, but not me personally, but one of my colleagues was involved in the negotiations to end the war in Colombia, and the negotiations. The teams would meet for 2 weeks in Havana, Cuba, and then they'd have a week off, and they would go back and forth. And he was one of the 9 people on the government side with the 9 people on the FARC side. I think what that conversation was like was quite different than what you might try to accomplish with your neighbor. But I would say in general, it's the language, the openness, the body language. The fact is, are other people doing things that make you put your guard down or that make you lift your guard up? I would say all of those things are important. If you're speaking in a way that encourages the other person to be defensive, then I think something is problematic. But I would also put it on a different level that if you wanted to take a deeper answer, I would say one of the problems we have in our society, and I see this in my work in working on depolarization in many countries, is that people can think they're being civil and they can do everything. They can sort of follow a set of rules of what it means to be civil, but simply by the type of topic they choose, that in itself can be viewed as uncivil. I know people who are, I don't want to pick on a particular side, but I know people who work on depolarization and at the same time they're working on promoting certain values. And those things and those values aren't like basic morality, thou shalt not kill. I mean, they're values that another side in the debate might view as an attack on their values. So to have a civic conversation, it doesn't mean you're not going to get deep into debates on different contentious issues. But I think people need to have an incredible level of self-awareness to understand that simply the type of topics, the type of words they use can be perceived as uncivil and polarizing to the other side. And I can actually see people who are peacekeeping, but mostly they come from one side in a country. And unless they're trained to think about like narratives and language, they're unaware of how their subconscious biases basically make them ineffective in their work. So I would say to be properly civil, you really need to get deep on many of these levels. Again, it depends what you're doing. If you're talking about borrowing milk, it's different than having a conversation on some of these different polarizing issues.
I think your point is a really good one, and I'm thinking about this particularly in the context of conversations that people have over culture war issues, because those are the kinds of issues that people try to come together and talk about, and yet one side or the other or both sides perceive the other side as really attacking them at a level of their core values. And I think that's part of what makes it so very, very difficult for us to have really good conversations and useful conversations around some of these culture war topics. But I'm wondering, how do you
if I may interject, Tom, I think the challenge is that people have turned values into like their the fundamental moral worldview, and they're unaware of just how they speak can be a turnoff to other people. And so I think it's okay to debate these issues, but people really need to, if they really want to be civil, they need to step out of some of their biases. And again, this is complicated because there are fundamental moral issues that I don't think you can compromise on. But there are culture war issues that people feel they can't compromise on, that they need to at least put aside. They may not change their opinion, but they need to put aside. And if they're ever going to have a civic conversation with another person from another side.
Good point. Thank you for picking up on that. Thinking about your work in fragile neighborhoods, I'm going to assume, but you can certainly correct me here, that there is an important role that civil dialogue plays in repairing the fragile neighborhoods in American society. Is that correct? Can you say more about that? Or say, no, Tom, you missed it.
So I think we can think about this on two levels. One is, I believe creating flourishing neighborhoods is an issue that people on the left and right can all agree upon. From my experience in the last year, I see a lot of interest and a lot of support for the basic idea that flourishing neighborhoods is a very nice, very important issue that people on both sides of the political spectrum can get around. They use different language. The left seems to be a little bit focused on the material. The right seems to be more focused on the social dynamics and so on and so forth. But so on one level, I think having a discourse with people from different political backgrounds on how to improve a neighborhood or how to improve all neighborhoods across the country is something that can help promote bipartisanship or post-partisanship or civil discourse around questions about how to improve our society. These are things, the approaches might be different at times, but the basic end goal is something that I think can. So that's one level. I think it can reduce the tensions by having some sort of common North Star. I think on a second level, when we focus on the local and the practical, it tends to disarm some of the polarization, because the polarization tends to be about very abstract and distant goals. And the more we're focused on making improvements in our streets, in our local institutions, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, and things that make neighborhoods more successful, I think it's something that, again, brings people together on a very personal basis. In terms of working with neighbors, an ideal neighborhood should be cross-class and cross-politics. So if you live in a good neighborhood, ideally, you should be very comfortable speaking with, and you should have an abundance of people from the opposite political persuasion. If you live in a place and everyone has the same politics as you, I'm thinking either that's very homogeneous and that's not as healthy a neighborhood as it could be, or I'm also thinking there's probably more people in that neighborhood who disagree with you but are afraid to talk about it, and therefore there's a lack of civil discourse. And so I would say I live in a neighborhood where there are a certain amount of Democrats and there's a certain amount of Republicans and there's a certain amount of people who don't want to talk politics, and we have everything. And I think it's healthier. And so a strong neighborhood should be politically diverse. It should be class diverse. These multiple diversities, you need something to bring people together. And that's when I talk about all the institutions and the physical. But I would certainly think the more we're able to cooperate and talk with people and do things practically locally, the better our civil discourse will be locally and nationally.
Seth, in that same vein, without using names or identifying information, of course, can you tell us about a difficult conversation you had with someone, but were able to maintain that civility? Can you give us an example of what you have been sharing?
Can I talk about my 5-year-old or something
Yeah.
like that? I would
Your
say,
choice.
and I have to say that the hardest place, it's so much easier to remain civil when it's not my kids. So I would say much easier trying to deal with ethnic or religious tensions in Nigeria than try to be civil when my son is taking about 3 hours to get out of the house in the morning, and my daughter is smacking him because he's not doing something that why she have to. My daughter is 11, but she's the mother all the time to her younger brother. So I would just say, I don't know if that's a good example, but I would say if you can learn to remain civil, and I have to remind myself almost every day, if these kids are training me to remain civil in my life, and I'm failing. So I would say there's no better training than having to be a parent, especially if your kids are I was the same way. It must be in the genes. They're like very good at not listening, doing their own thing. I mean, I meet some kids, I'm like, these kids, how do they listen? They certainly don't come from my family. So I would say the best training house is trying to remain civil and with your family. So I don't know if that's what you wanted, but I would say that's easily by far and away the hardest conversations I have is in my house every single day. It's great training, and I'm mostly failing, but I'm trying my best.
Well, I think though you raise a point that a lot of us do have to kind of face, not just necessarily with our children, but also with our families and extended families, because we're in close relationship with people we care deeply about, but we may have very different perspectives on things that are important to us. And being able to have a civil conversation in those high stakes relationships is important as well. Those kind of tools that we've talked about in the past here on this podcast of how do you listen, how do you show respect, etc., come into play and are very important. How do you know?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. How do you know in these roles that you're successful?
How do you know if it's successful? I would say, if I may give a larger example, I would say one of the more uncomfortable. If I think about engaging with people, I tend to not want to provoke conflict. So I can think of lots of conversations where people were saying things, whether it was because of cultural issues or political issues, that I did not agree with. And yet I just basically swallowed my tongue and says, it's not important that we have a disagreement. It's not important for me to voice my opinion. And I just want to, I have neighbors. I'm a big fan of not putting statements on my bumper sticker of my car and not putting statements on my front lawn. And believe me, I have a lot of issues I care a lot about. And I keep thinking, would I at least put an American flag up? But I even think that at times is contentious at some level to some people. And so I have nothing. Anything we might have is inside the house, and nothing, you can't even tell anything identifying who we are. So I think if you're in your neighborhood, you would be doing your best to just promote good relationships away from these issues. And if there's people who talk a bit too much about it, I would be tempted to, on a very personal basis, just ask the person to put some of these aside so that we have better relationships, better cohesion. That's how I would tend to view some of these things. I'm not sure it's exactly the answer that you would want, but I'm a fan of relationships first, and politics and other things that will divide us, putting them aside when we can.
So, Seth, I had a question for you but I think maybe you've already answered this in an earlier. But I do want to give you an opportunity, to maybe expand upon it just a little bit, if you're so inclined, because right now, as we enter 2024, there is a lot of concern that people have about the state of our democracy. There's a lot of concern that people have about what could be happening over the next few months, and in the political arena. And so, what thoughts do you have about the role that civil conversation plays in a democracy, and in fact, perhaps preserving a democracy?
I think for the reasons that you allude to, this will not be an easy year for many people, partly because they will be very anxious. I know a lot of people that will be anxious about this election, and in a highly functioning, highly democratic society. This is an extremely democratic society. We need to think of society as opposed to, I think we have a decay in our civic institutions over the last 2 generations, yet we still remain very democratic as people. And I do think there's a great need to boost the daily institutions we interact with that allow us to have relationships with people on many levels outside of politics. And that will make politics healthier. And I think one of the reasons why we have anxiety is because our declining connectiveness has led to greater alienation, greater anger, greater polarization, and that affects politics in many, many ways. But in terms of what you say, again, it depends on where people live. It's so much of our country, people seem to live in places where everyone votes a certain way or the other way. And I would say the most important thing that we can be doing is just maintaining dialogue with people, trying to understand their perspective, trying to get into their shoes. When I travel to a country, or when I travel to America, basically, when I did my research for Fragile Neighborhoods, I always try to see things the way other people see things. I did homestays. I read books that the authors from those places would write. I go visit different places, different parts, talk to lots of people, whether it's taxi cab drivers or people on the street, people in the restaurant, and everywhere. Talk about their history, their lives, their journey, their feelings. Politics is at best the end of the conversation, never the beginning. But I would say the more we're intentional, there's things that used to happen without us being intentional, but because of the decay of our civic institutions, I think we need to be much more intentional about making relationships with our neighbors. We need to be much more intentional about being engaged with people from different political backgrounds. To the extent that we're able to do that and have healthy conversations, I just think that we will be more understanding. We'll be less angry, and we will be more likely to have if everybody did that, which is a big ask given that not everyone is listening to us here, but the more we're able to have these bridging institutions and bridging relationships, I just think we'll have stronger shock absorbers, and we'll be less anxious, and we'll feel more comfortable with whatever the year brings us.
Seth, you've graciously allowed us to quiz you, and you've answered our questions, and more than answered our questions. We very much appreciate that. What kind of questions might you have for Tom and I?
Okay, that's a curveball. So I appreciate that very much. So I would say, I think one of my bigger questions, I think I'm always asking people, when you do this podcast or you do your daily work, what kind of theory of change? I mean, again, if we just think of the podcast, what do you expect listeners or viewers to do differently, and how do they multiply those efforts to other people? But you could also answer this question in terms of your work. Where do you see that you have the biggest value add, and how do you see that value add leading to, I would say, cascading? Because really, what we're in the business of doing incremental steps that have cascading effects. So I would ask you how you think about those things.
Wow, that's really easy. Of course, no. Excellent question. Thanks, Seth. So,
I could give you a harder question if you want.
No, I've already done the dissertation work. I'm good. So, go ahead, Lamar.
Sure. I've spent most of my career working with individuals and large groups of people and working in communities, helping people solve problems and working through some of the experiences that they've had. At this side of my working career, I'm finding it valuable to become more involved in my community and looking at some of the challenges that maybe we have to face. That's not an easy task. Even when I was in the working world, now it's kind of a different task. You have to build that trust. You have to rebuild some of those relationships again. I'm finding this podcast has been a good exercise, one for me, to begin to organize more of my work outside of my relationships outside of the podcast. But I'm finding that locally, the podcast having impact as the listeners who are more local that I'm aware of are using some of these techniques in some of the problem solving and some of the group kind of dynamics that they're involved in. I'm hoping that by broadcasting, and those who are listening who are not necessarily local are also finding the same kinds of tools and maybe strategies that they can put in place in their areas, just like what you're doing at a much larger scale. I'm hoping that what we're doing can have some impact as people begin to build relationships and solve difficult problems and have good communication. So it's all of that, both at a very local, relational level here for me, and what I see and hope is happening for other listeners.
I was really intrigued by your use of the word in your question of the theory of change. What's our theory of change? Unlike Lamar, I am still working, and in fact, doing this podcast is part of that work that I do in my small business, my small consulting business. And the theory of change, it's such an interesting way to ask that question, Seth. The theory of change for me is very closely aligned with what you talk about in Fragile Neighborhoods. For years, I have believed that there is something that is very significant that happens in relationships between people, and that the degree to which I am able to act with integrity and be in relationship with somebody that is positive and is helpful and is toward the greater good is the degree to which I'm hoping that they will take that same experience and pay that forward at an individual level and perhaps even at an organizational level. And so that's been very much a part of my work for the last several years. Like you, I did some research into this, and I find myself coming back again and again to these core ideas of trust and respect and integrity as really being cornerstones of being a really healthy relationship with people, and the degree to which we have those. We have a good relationship with people and between institutions. So my hope is that at least in my very small corner of the world in which I work and live, that I'm able to make that kind of impact at an individual level with people, that they then pay it forward and carry it forward in their lives and in their work as well. That's my hope. And by the way, have I done all of that perfectly? Absolutely not. And Lamar knows that better than most folks. I've not been perfect in doing that, but it's a little bit like ballroom dancing and golf. You never do it perfectly, right?
There's
you're
no
always,
perfection in the real world. Let's put it that way,
There's no
Tom.
perfection in the real world. You're always just trying to do it a little bit better.
There's nothing. Unless you're doing. I guess if you have a multiple choice test or something, you could get a perfect score. But mostly for real work, there's no perfection. There's even relationships. No one is perfect at it.
Yeah. Well, Seth, we really, really appreciate you being with us today, and we'd love to have you come back in the future. At any time you just feel like you want to chat, just let me know, and we'll put you into the podcast and we'll just chat away. But we've really covered a lot today, and I'm glad that we are able to dig a little bit deeper into the concept of fragile states and into the basic ideas within your book, Fragile Neighborhoods. And I just want to say to folks that are listening, if you haven't picked up a copy of Fragile Neighborhoods, please do so. It's not going to break your bank. It's a very reasonably priced book, and it's going to make you think. It's going to make you think about where you live, about the relationships that you have with people, and how you can improve those relationships and really create a better place to live for everybody, to heal your neighborhood if in fact it is fragile or broken. And certainly all of this goes to making our country a better place in a year that promises to be, or maybe threatens to be, a rather challenging time for us. So Seth, thank you very, very much. We just really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Lamar. So much appreciate this.
Thank you.
Well, we have really enjoyed having Seth Kaplan on the podcast, and we hope you did too. I had to laugh when he talked about the challenges of communicating with civility with his 5-year-old son. Right. Oh my gosh. We've all been there with family members, right? Whether we have children or that uncle or that aunt or even our parents that we just sometimes we got to kind of, grit our teeth and get through it. Otherwise, we may lose it. I'm really hoping that we can get Seth back sometime in the future. Lamar, So do you want to tip folks off to what we are considering for our next podcast?
Sure. We've heard from our listeners that having guests has been a valuable, kind of a nice change, and also kind of expanding the thoughts and the perspectives of that we're going for on this podcast, and that's been great. But strangely, they also would like to hear more from us. So, our next podcast we're going back again. It's going to be just the two of us. We're going to talk about, we've been talking about getting to third space, and this is so much the center of what this podcast is about. But we're going to talk about, we're going to explore the idea, is it sustainable to stay in this space? And are there other spaces that we need to think about, and what are those other spaces, and how do they relate to third space? And we're going to be following this up with some other guests as well. But Tom, maybe you could talk about what the other guests are. But next time it's going to be you and I talking about third space and some other spaces that complement third space.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that conversation. We've kind of kicked that can around a little bit, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun for us to do that as part of the podcast. But after that, we're going to be reaching way over the great Atlantic pond to the United Kingdom to a guy by the name of Ed Schrager. Now, Ed works with charities in the UK, what we would call nonprofits here in the US. And part of his work is focused on building relationships between people in the workplace that are authentic and genuine. And in fact, he created a platform known as King Prawn to help organizations do that with the workforce. And I've actually participated in some King Prawn conversations that he set up, and I love them. It's really great to get to know people from other parts of the country, other parts of the world. And Ed is also very much into artificial intelligence as well. And so we're going to tap into his expertise with AI to have a conversation about reality. And how do we know when a source of information is truthful and valid? Something that, at least right now and the past few years, has been one of those topics that's one of those issues that's made it really challenging for people to come together and have civil conversations, is when they have two different perspectives on what is real and what is truthful.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about this on a number of occasions, and that, we all kind of have our favorite places to go to get information. And sometimes, we find ourselves just kind of building our own biases based off where we go. And so how do we know where else to go and where good resources are? I think this will be the beginning of another good conversation. I think it's one of those that we might return to more than once.
Plus, Ed has a great British accent, I just want to say.
So remember, we try to be responsive to suggestions that you might have as listeners. However, we do need to hear from you. There are a couple of different ways that you can be in touch with us. First of all, you can leave us a voice message on Spotify, which is hosting this podcast. And of course, we both have emails, and you can contact us on the emails. Mine is lamar.thirdspace@gmail.com, and Tom's is tom.thirdspace@gmail.com. Not a whole lot of difference except our first names. You'll find, if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, you'll find these at the bottom of the page. Otherwise, please write that down and send us a note if you have comments, suggestions. If you want to like us on the podcast, that's always helpful, or to leave a comment, we would appreciate it. Remember, third space is spelled with the number 3.
Yes, indeed. And you also, if you're listening, you'll find it in the show notes as well. So it's down there too. So, well, Lamar, we got weather issues we got to deal with in our individual spaces. I can't get my dog to go out.
I can't get my dog to come in.
Well, so I guess we got to take a break here and go wrestle our dogs.
Absolutely. Hey, it's been great.
Yeah.
You take care. Keep your feet warm.
I will. And you stay dry out there, okay?
All right, man. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Tom here. Thank you for listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Remember to click on subscribe to be sure you get notices about new episodes. Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom is a production of Tenacious Change. Opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are solely those of Lamar, Roth, and Tom Klaus. And we'd like to hear your opinions and ideas too. You can leave us a voice message on Spotify, or you can email us at the addresses found in the show notes. Also, in the show notes, you can find links to some of the things we talked about today so you can check them out for yourself. Until next time, keep moving toward third space.